Please, Reverend, don't leave us. The woman's voice cracked on the last word, and Reverend Josiah Caine felt something break inside his chest. Something he'd spent 3 years carefully holding together with prayer and solitude. He stood in the dusty yard of the Hayes Ranch, his saddlebags already packed on his horse, the setting sun painting everything the color of dried blood. "Ma'am, I've already stayed 2 days longer than I intended." His voice came out harsher than he meant. "I'm a traveling preacher," the key word being traveling. "Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference." Martha Hayes, the eldest of the three widowed sisters, took a step forward. Her calico dress was faded and patched, her hands work roughened and trembling. Behind her, her two younger sisters stood on the porch of the weathered ranch house, their faces pale as ghosts in the dying light. "The curse will take us next," Martha whispered, "just like it took our husbands, just like it's taken every man who's tried to help us." Josiah's jaw tightened. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in evil men and bad luck and the harsh realities of frontier life. But he'd seen the fear in this town, the way shopkeepers crossed themselves when these women walked by, the way the sheriff's eyes slid away when asked about the 3 mysterious deaths that had left these sisters alone on a failing ranch. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, gripping his reins tighter. "But I can't. They'll burn us out within the month." This came from Amanda, the middle sister, her educated voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "Dalton Carson has already made his intentions clear. Without a man on the property, we have no protection, no hope." The youngest, Rebecca, said nothing. She just stared at him with those impossibly blue eyes, and Josiah saw something in her face that reminded him of another woman, another lifetime, another failure he could never outrun. He'd made a promise to himself after Eleanor died. Never again would he let himself care. Never again would he stay in one place long enough to lose anyone. But as he looked at these 3 desperate women standing in the shadow of a house that might become their tomb, he felt the foundations of that promise begin to crumble. The wind picked up, carrying dust devils across the yard and the distant howl of coyotes from the hills. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, Josiah could have sworn he had heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, or maybe it was just his own heart, pounding out a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like judgment. What Josiah didn't tell those 3 desperate women was that he'd already seen their husbands' graves. He'd arrived in Redemption Creek 2 days earlier, dusty and bone-tired from 3 weeks on the trail, looking for nothing more than a hot meal and a place to sleep before moving on. The town had that peculiar silence that frontier settlements get when they're harboring a secret. Conversations dying when strangers approach, eyes that wouldn't quite meet his, a tension in the air like the moment before a rattlesnake strikes. The first grave he'd found was in the small cemetery behind the whitewashed church. Thomas Hayes, it read, beloved husband of Martha, died in his sleep, May 1887, age 31. The second was 3 plots over. William Turner, husband to Amanda, fell from barn loft, June 1887, age 29. The third, barely 2 months old, the earth still fresh, James Porter, cherished by Rebecca, trampled by horse, July 1887, age 24. 3 men, 3 sisters, 3 deaths in 3 months. Even for the Wild West, that was a hell of a coincidence. The town preacher, an elderly man named Reverend Mills, had been the one to explain over weak coffee in the church rectory. "It's the land," he'd said, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted his cup. "That ranch belonged to old Marcus Hayes before he died. Thomas was his only son, inherited it all. But there's water on that property, Reverend Caine. Sweet water that runs year-round, and Dalton Carson has wanted it for his spread since before Marcus was cold in the ground." "You think Carson killed these men?" Josiah had asked. Mills had looked away. "I think the devil works in mysterious ways, and I think some men are better at doing his bidding than others. I also think no one in this town has the backbone to stand against Carson, myself included. The old preacher had met his eyes then, something like shame flickering in his gaze. I'm too old and too afraid. But you've got the look of a man who's faced worse than Dalton Carson. Josiah had left that conversation intending to ride out at first light. He'd faced worse than Carson, yes. Had faced his own wife's death, his infant daughter's fever-racked body, his complete inability to save either of them, despite all his prayers and faith. He'd faced the ashes of his own soul and found nothing there worth salvaging. He'd become a traveling preacher because moving meant not having to remember, not having to care. But then he'd accepted an invitation to dinner at the Hayes Ranch. Just being neighborly, he'd told himself, and he'd met Martha with her fierce maternal protectiveness over her younger sisters, Amanda with her quiet intelligence and barely concealed terror, and Rebecca with her impossible hope that somehow, despite everything, things might still turn out all right. He'd met three women who reminded him that faith wasn't about safety or guarantees. It was about standing in the face of darkness and refusing to blink. So when Martha had caught him packing his saddlebags at dawn, when she'd begged him to stay with tears in her eyes and desperation in her voice, he'd felt the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crack. Now, standing in that dusty yard with the sun bleeding out behind the mountains, he made a decision that he knew might cost him everything. 1 week, he said, his voice rough. I'll stay 1 week. Help you repair the property, make it look lived in and protected. Maybe that'll be enough to keep Carson at bay until you can figure something else out. The relief that flooded Martha's face was so profound, it was almost painful to witness. Behind her, Amanda sagged against the porch railing, and Rebecca let out a breath that might have been a sob. Thank you, Martha whispered. Thank you, Reverend. Josiah unsaddled his horse, trying to ignore the voice in his head that told him he was making a terrible mistake. He'd come to Redemption Creek running from ghosts. He had a feeling he was about to create some new ones. The house told its own story of tragedy. Inside, everything was too clean, too carefully maintained. The desperate preservation of women trying to hold on to normalcy in the face of chaos. The main room held a large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 6 chairs, 3 now permanently empty, and walls decorated with a strange mixture of delicate needlework and harsh frontier practicality. A rifle hung above the mantel next to a sampler that read, "Blessed are the pure in heart." Martha showed him to a small room off the kitchen, barely more than a storage closet with a cot and a single window that looked out over the dying vegetable garden. It's not much, she apologized, her hands twisting in her apron. But it's the safest room in the house. No windows facing the trail and close to the kitchen in case anything happens at night. In case Carson's men come calling, Josiah translated. Her eyes met his, and he saw she was done with pretense. Yes, over a dinner of thin stew and hard bread, these women were clearly running out of supplies. Josiah learned the full extent of their situation. The ranch consisted of 200 acres of scrubland, with that precious creek running through the eastern edge, a small barn that was barely standing, a dozen cattle that had somehow survived neglect and drought, and a chicken coop that had been raided by coyotes so many times it was practically useless. Thomas was building us up, Martha explained, her voice careful and controlled in that way people have when they're discussing the dead. He had plans for expansion, was negotiating with buyers in Cheyenne for our beef. Then he just stopped breathing one night. Doctor said his heart gave out, but Thomas was strong as an ox. William was helping us after Thomas died, Amanda continued, her educated Eastern accent still evident despite years on the frontier. He'd been courting me in town. He was the assistant bank manager, a good man. We married quickly, perhaps too quickly, but we needed help and he was willing. 3 weeks later, he fell from the barn loft while checking for roof damage. She paused. The strange thing was, there was rope burn on his ankle. Rebecca, the youngest, spoke for the first time since he'd agreed to stay. James was my choice, not an arrangement or a desperate grab at survival. I loved him. Her blue eyes were fierce. He'd worked on ranches his whole life. He could ride any horse ever born. but his mount spooked during a simple check of the fence line and trampled him to death. She leaned forward. That horse? Gentlest creature you ever met. We had to put her down afterward because she'd gone mad somehow, like something had driven her into a frenzy. Josiah set down his spoon. You think someone poisoned the horse? I think, Martha said quietly, that someone is very determined to get this land, and they don't care how many people die in the process. Why not just leave? Josiah asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Sell to Carson, take whatever money you can get, and start over somewhere safe. The three sisters exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Because this is our home, Martha finally said. Because we buried 3 good men in that cemetery, and will be damned if their deaths mean nothing. And because, she hesitated, because if we leave, Carson wins, and men like him need to understand that they can't just take whatever they want. It was the kind of stubborn frontier honor that got people killed. Josiah recognized it because he'd once had it himself, before life had beaten it out of him. Tell me about Carson, he said. Amanda was the one who answered, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone reciting facts to maintain emotional distance. Dalton Carson owns the Bar C Ranch, the largest spread in the territory. He came here 5 years ago from Texas, brought 20 armed men with him, and proceeded to acquire, through various means, every significant water source in the valley except ours. He's been making offers on this property since before Marcus Hayes died. Offers that started reasonable and have become increasingly threatening. He's been to the house? 3 times, Rebecca said. The last time was 2 days after James's funeral. He stood right where you're sitting now and told us that accidents seem to follow this property, and it would be a shame if something happened to 3 helpless women. Josiah felt anger stir in his gut, the first real emotion he'd allowed himself in years beyond grief and numbness. I take it the sheriff won't help. The sheriff, Martha said bitterly, is on Carson's payroll. So is half the town. The other half is too scared to act. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of impossible odds settling over the table like dust. But Josiah had learned something important during his 3 years of running from himself. Sometimes the only way out of hell was straight through it. Josiah woke before dawn to the sound of gunshots in the distance. He was out of bed and gripping his revolver before his mind fully caught up with his body. Old instincts from the war, from a lifetime of frontier violence, flooding back like muscle memory. Through the small window, he could see the sky just beginning to lighten, stars still visible above the dark ridge of mountains. Another shot, then silence. He pulled on his pants and boots, checked his revolver, and moved quietly into the main house. The 3 sisters were already awake, Martha emerging from the bedroom she shared with Amanda, Rebecca slipping down from the loft space above, all of them dressed and moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd become accustomed to middle-of-the-night crises. Cattle, Martha said shortly, answering his unasked question. They're scattering our cattle. Happened twice last week. By the time we get out there, the steers are gone into the hills, and it takes us days to round them up, if we find them at all. How many men? Josiah asked. We never see them. They stay at distance, fire shots to spook the herd, and disappear. Josiah moved to the window, scanning the dark landscape. He could make out the vague shapes of their remaining cattle beginning to scatter, hear their panicked lowing. The shots had come from the northwest, up in the tree line where riders could hide easily. Stay inside, he ordered. Bar the door after I leave. You can't go out there alone, Amanda started, but Josiah was already moving, grabbing his rifle from beside the door, his hat from its peg. If I'm not back in an hour, ride to town and get help. Any help, even if it's useless. At least get it on record that something happened. He didn't wait for their response. He was out the door and moving toward the barn, using the pre-dawn darkness for cover, his eyes adjusting quickly to the gloom. His horse, a tough buckskin gelding named Abraham, nickered softly as he approached. Easy, boy, Josiah murmured, saddling quickly but carefully. Just like old times, right? Except instead of Confederate soldiers, we're chasing cattle rustlers. Progress. He rode out hard, not toward where the shots had come from, but toward where the cattle would scatter, reading the land and the herd's panic with skills he'd learned years ago in Texas. The key wasn't to chase the rustlers. They'd be long gone. The key was to get ahead of the cattle and turn them back before they disappeared into the rough country where they'd be impossible to recover. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten as he worked, whistling and calling, using Abraham to press the frightened steers back toward the home pasture. It was exhausting, frustrating work. These were half-wild range cattle, not the docile dairy cows of the East, and they were determined to run. But Josiah was more determined, and as he rode, circling and cutting and slowly turning the small herd back toward the Hayes property, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose. He was still himself, still the man who'd failed his family, still the preacher who'd lost his faith along with his wife and child. But for the first time since Eleanor's death, he was choosing to fight for something instead of running from it. By the time he got the last steer back into the home pasture, the sun was fully up and he could see all three sisters standing on the porch, watching. Martha had a rifle cradled in her arms. Amanda was scanning the tree line with a spyglass. Rebecca had her hand shading her eyes, tracking his movement across the grassland. They looked like sentinels, like warriors, like women who'd already buried 3 men and were preparing to bury a 4th if necessary, but who'd be damned if they went down without a fight. Josiah rode back to the barn, dismounted, and began unsaddling Abraham. He was exhausted, sweating despite the morning chill, and his shoulder, which had taken a mini-ball during the war, was screaming in protest. Martha appeared in the barn doorway, still carrying that rifle. "You got them all back." "This time," Josiah said. "Next time they'll try something different." "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. "You don't know us. This isn't your fight." Josiah finished with the saddle, turned to face her. The morning light caught her face, and he saw she was younger than he'd initially thought. Maybe 27, 28. Too young to be this tired, to carry this much weight. "Maybe I'm tired of running," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. "We all are, Reverend." She turned to leave, then paused. "There's coffee and breakfast inside, and later, there's something I need to show you. Something about my husband's death that doesn't add up." And Josiah knew then that he wasn't staying for just a week. Whatever was happening on this ranch, whatever conspiracy of violence and greed was unfolding in this corner of Wyoming, he was in it now until the end. He'd stopped running. God help him. After breakfast, Martha led him to the barn, the same barn where William Turner had allegedly fallen to his death. The building was in poor repair, weathered gray wood and a sagging roofline that probably wouldn't survive another harsh winter. Inside, it smelled of hay and horse manure and something else. Old blood, maybe, or just the accumulated weight of tragedy. Martha climbed the ladder to the loft without hesitation, her skirts bunched up practically in one hand, moving with the confidence of a woman who'd done this 100 times. Josiah followed, testing each rung carefully. These were the same boards that had supposedly failed William Turner. But when he reached the loft, he saw immediately what Martha wanted him to see. The boards weren't rotten. They weren't even particularly old. Someone had replaced a section of the loft floor, maybe 10 feet by 6 feet, with new lumber that didn't match the rest of the structure. And in one corner, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a dark stain that had seeped into the wood grain. "This is where William fell," Martha said quietly. She knelt beside the stain, her fingers tracing the outline. "Or where he was pushed. The sheriff said it was an accident, that these old boards gave way, but Thomas had just replaced this entire section 2 weeks before he died. The wood was new, solid. I watched him do it." Josiah knelt beside her, examining the boards carefully. There were scratches on the surface, gouges that looked like they'd been made by boot heels. And along one edge, he found what he was looking for: rope marks worn into the wood from friction. "Someone strung a rope," he said slowly, working it out, "probably across the opening at ankle height. William came up here in the dark or near dark, didn't see it, tripped and went over the edge. They removed the rope afterward." Martha nodded, her face pale. "And the sheriff called it an accident. Didn't even investigate, just wrote it up as a tragic fall and moved on." "Who knew William was coming up here that day?" "Everyone," Martha said bitterly. He'd mentioned at breakfast that the roof was leaking, and he wanted to check for damage before the next rain. Anyone watching the house would have known. Josiah stood, moving to the edge of the loft where William would have fallen. It was a 15-foot drop onto hard-packed dirt and scattered hay, enough to kill a man, especially if he landed wrong. He looked out over the ranch from this vantage point, could see the house, the creek in the distance, the rough trail that led to the main road. Could also see a rider approaching fast, dust rising behind his horse. "Company," he said sharply. Martha was at his side instantly, her hand finding his arm in instinctive fear. "Carson?" "Can't tell yet." They climbed down quickly, Josiah making sure to go first in case the rider was trouble. By the time they reached the yard, Amanda and Rebecca had emerged from the house, and the rider was close enough to identify. Not Carson, but maybe worse, the sheriff, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a badge pinned to his vest and an expression of practiced indifference on his sun-weathered face. "Morning, ladies," Sheriff Coleman said, pulling his horse to a stop. His eyes slid over to Josiah, calculating. "Heard you got yourselves a man staying on the property. Wanted to come by and make sure everything was proper." "Reverend Caine is our guest," Martha said, her voice cold as winter iron. "Perfectly proper, Sheriff." Coleman dismounted, his hand resting on his gun in a casual way that was anything but casual. "Reverend, is it? Funny, Reverend Mills didn't mention hiring any help." "I'm not hired by Mills," Josiah said evenly. "I'm a traveling preacher. Moved through, decided to stay a few days, and help these ladies with some repairs before I head on." "That's so." Coleman walked a slow circle around the yard, his eyes taking in everything. "Malasaitas ram," clang. The repaired fence post Josiah had fixed yesterday, the neat stack of firewood, the fact that the cattle were all back in their pasture. "Well now, that's real Christian of you, Reverend. Real Christian. But you should know that staying on this property, it has a tendency to be dangerous to a man's health." The threat was barely veiled. Josiah felt anger rise in his chest, but kept his voice level. "I'll bear that in mind, Sheriff." "You do that." Coleman mounted his horse again, but before he rode off, he leaned down toward Martha. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Carson mentioned he's prepared to increase his offer on the property. Might be worth your while to at least hear him out. Save everyone a lot of trouble." He didn't wait for an answer, just touched his hat and rode off, leaving a silence in his wake that felt heavy as lead. Rebecca was the first to speak, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "He didn't even pretend to care about our safety. Just came to warn us. To warn you." "They're getting nervous," Amanda observed, her analytical mind working through the implications. "The fact that you showed up, that you stayed, that you're clearly not intimidated, it's disrupting their timeline. They wanted us desperate and alone. Now we're neither." Josiah watched the sheriff disappear down the trail, dust settling in his wake. He was thinking about rope marks and replaced boards and cattle scattered in the night. He was thinking about 3 men dead in 3 months and 3 women who refused to bend. "Tell me about Thomas's death," he said to Martha. "Everything you remember about that night." Her eyes met his, and he saw she understood. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were investigating. They were fighting back. That evening, after the chores were done and the cattle were settled, the 4 of them sat around the kitchen table, and Martha told him about the night her husband died. "It was early May," she began, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "We'd just gotten through the worst of the spring storms. Thomas was in good spirits. He'd struck a deal with a buyer in Cheyenne, and we were going to drive 50 head up there in June. It would have given us enough money to make it through the winter and then some." Amanda picked up the thread. "I was living in town at the time, but I came out to visit that week. Thomas was telling me about his plans for expansion, how he wanted to build a proper barn, maybe hire a few hands. He was talking about the future like it was guaranteed." "We went to bed like normal," Martha continued, her voice growing softer. "Maybe 10 o'clock, 10:30. I fell asleep almost immediately. I'd been up since dawn working in the garden. Sometime in the night, I woke up because Thomas was breathing strangely, gasping almost. I tried to wake him, but he wouldn't respond. By the time I got a lamp lit and ran for help, he was gone. Dr. White said heart failure," Rebecca added. "She'd been 13 when it happened. barely more than a child, perfectly natural for a man of Thomas's age and stress level. But Thomas was only 31 and he was healthy as a horse. Josiah leaned back in his chair, thinking, did he eat or drink anything unusual that night? Anything that only he consumed? Martha frowned, trying to remember. We all ate the same dinner. Beef stew, bread, apple cobbler. He had whiskey before bed, he usually did, but it was from a bottle we'd been drinking from for weeks. Where's that bottle now? I poured it out after he died. Couldn't stand the sight of it. Damn, if Thomas had been poisoned, and Josiah was increasingly certain he had been, the evidence was gone. What about visitors? Josiah asked. Anyone come by the house that day or the few days before? The three sisters exchanged glances. Carson, Amanda said slowly. Carson came by about 2 days before Thomas died. He made another offer on the property. Thomas turned him down, quite forcefully. Told him to get off his land and not come back. Was Carson alone? No, Martha said, her eyes widening as she remembered. He had his foreman with him. Big man, nasty scar across his cheek. Name's Garrett, Jake Garrett. Did they come in the house? Just for a few minutes. Thomas offered them coffee out of politeness, even though the meeting was tense. But they didn't drink it, said they couldn't stay. Josiah felt pieces clicking into place. Did Thomas drink his coffee after they left? Martha's hand flew to her mouth. Yes, he poured himself another cup from the pot and sat at this table going over his books. He was drinking that coffee all afternoon. Anyone could have slipped something into the pot while you were distracted, Josiah said. Something slow acting, something that wouldn't take effect until that night. By the time Thomas died, the coffee would be long gone and no one would think to check for poison. The silence that followed was profound. These women had suspected murder, but having it confirmed, having the mechanics of it laid out so coldly, was something else entirely. We have no proof, Amanda said finally, her practical mind reasserting itself. Even if we went to the sheriff, which would be pointless since he's in Carson's pocket, we have no evidence. The coffee pot was washed, the whiskey bottle emptied, Thomas's body buried 2 years ago. What about William's death? Josiah asked. The rope marks on the barn loft? Can we prove someone was there? Rebecca shook her head. The sheriff looked at the scene for maybe 5 minutes and pronounced it an accident. He didn't examine anything closely, and by now any tracks or other evidence would be long gone. And James, Josiah turned to Rebecca. Tell me exactly what happened the day he died. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she set down her own coffee cup. It was a Saturday morning. James rode out to check the fence line on the eastern edge of the property. We'd had reports of cattle getting through onto Carson's land, and we wanted to find the break before we lost any more stock. He took Daisy, his favorite mare, the gentlest horse we owned. She paused, visibly steadying herself. He'd been gone maybe 2 hours when we heard the horse screaming. We ran out and found Daisy in a complete panic, eyes rolling, foam on her mouth, bucking and kicking at nothing. James was on the ground, trampled almost beyond recognition. He'd been thrown and then she just kept striking him. Did anyone examine the horse before you put her down? Josiah asked gently. Doc White looked at her briefly, said she'd probably been spooked by a rattlesnake or maybe eaten some loco weed. But it was the wrong season for loco weed, and James would have known to avoid any areas where it grew. Josiah thought about this. A horse driven into a murderous frenzy, a man trampled beyond recognition, and conveniently no evidence because the horse had been destroyed. What if someone poisoned Daisy? He said slowly. Something that would make her go mad, loco weed maybe, fed to her deliberately. Or worse, something administered that morning that would take effect a few hours later, right when James was far from help. Martha stood abruptly, began pacing the small kitchen. 3 murders made to look like accidents, a pattern designed to look like a curse or bad luck, all perfectly timed to drive us off this land. And it would have worked, Amanda said bitterly. If you hadn't showed up, Reverend, we were about ready to give up. Another month, maybe 2, and we would have sold to Carson for whatever he offered just to get out alive. Josiah looked at these 3 women, these survivors, and felt something settle into place in his chest, a sense of rightness he hadn't felt since before Eleanor died. Then we need to make sure he doesn't get another chance, he said. We need to set a trap. The three sisters stared at him. A trap? Martha repeated. Carson thinks I'm just a traveling preacher who'll move on soon enough. He's probably planning his next move. Another accident, another scare. But what if instead of waiting for him to act, we force his hand? Make him come to us on our terms. How? Rebecca demanded. Josiah smiled, and it wasn't a particularly kind expression. We let him think he's won, and then we catch him in the act. For the first time since he'd arrived, he saw hope flicker in their eyes. The plan was simple, which meant it was probably going to go terribly wrong, but it was better than waiting around to be picked off one by one. Josiah rode into Redemption Creek the next morning, making sure he was seen. He stopped at the general store, the bank, the saloon, anywhere men gathered and gossip flowed. At each location, he made the same casual comments. That he'd enjoyed his stay at the Hayes Ranch, but it was time to move on. That traveling preachers couldn't settle down no matter how much they might want to. That he'd be leaving by the end of the week. Word would reach Carson by noon. Josiah was counting on it. What he didn't advertise was that he had no intention of actually leaving. The plan was to make it look like he was gone, pack up his gear, make a big show of riding out, but actually circle back under cover of darkness and hide in the barn. If Carson made a move on the now unprotected women, Josiah would be there to stop it. It wasn't a perfect plan. It wasn't even a particularly good plan. But it was something, and after 3 years of running from everything, Josiah found himself almost eager for the confrontation. He stopped at Reverend Mills's church on his way back to the ranch, found the old preacher in the small cemetery tending to graves. Reverend Caine, Mills greeted him, leaning on his shovel. Heard you're leaving us. Word travels fast. In a town this small, it travels instantaneous. Mills wiped sweat from his forehead. Can't say I blame you. That ranch has a way of devouring men. Or men have a way of devouring each other, Josiah said. He told Mills his theory about the murders, about Carson's systematic elimination of any man who stood between him and the Hayes property. Mills listened in silence, his weathered face growing more troubled with each detail. When Josiah finished, the old preacher shook his head slowly. You can't prove any of it, he said, and even if you could, no one in this town would testify against Carson. He owns the bank, he owns half the businesses, and what he doesn't own, he controls through fear. Going up against him is suicide. Then what do you suggest, Josiah asked, hearing the frustration creep into his voice? That I let 3 innocent women be murdered or driven from their home? That I watch evil win because it's safer than fighting it? Mills met his eyes and Josiah saw shame there. The kind of shame that comes from knowing you've failed in your most basic duties. I'm an old man, Reverend Caine, I am. I've made my compromises with the devil. I have to live with that. But you, he paused, you remind me of what I used to be before I got tired and scared. I'm just as tired and scared as you are, Josiah admitted. I'm not some hero. I'm a man who failed his own family and has been running from that failure ever since. And yet here you stand, preparing to fight anyway. Mills smiled faintly. Maybe that's what real faith is. Not the absence of fear or doubt, but the choice to act despite them. They stood together in the cemetery, surrounded by markers of the dead. And Josiah thought about Eleanor and their daughter, about all the prayers that had gone unanswered, about the faith he'd lost in a sick room 3 years ago. I don't know if I believe anymore, he said quietly. In God, in justice, in any of it. Belief isn't a feeling, son. It's a choice. You choose to act as if there's something worth fighting for, even when every bone in your body says otherwise. That's faith. Josiah left the cemetery with Mills's words ringing in his ears. He still wasn't sure he believed, wasn't sure he'd ever believe again, the way he once had. But he was sure of one thing. He was done running. When he got back to the ranch, he found Martha in the garden, working between rows of struggling vegetables. She looked up as he approached, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. Did you spread the word? She asked. Everyone in town thinks I'm leaving Friday morning. And are you? Josiah looked at her. really looked at her, saw the strength in the set of her shoulders, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the determination in the line of her jaw. Saw a woman who'd lost her husband, taken in her younger sisters, and refused to break no matter how much weight was piled on her back. "No," he said, "I'm staying." Something flickered across her face, relief, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite name. "You know this might get you killed." "I know." "Then why?" It was the same question she'd asked before, but this time he had a different answer. Or maybe the same answer, just more honestly given. "Because I'm tired of watching good people suffer while evil men prosper. Because 3 years ago I couldn't save my own family. But maybe I can save yours because—" He stopped, surprised by his own honesty. "Because you remind me that there are things in this world worth fighting for." Martha set down her gardening tools, wiped her hands on her apron. She stepped close to him, closer than propriety strictly allowed, and looked up into his face. "My husband was a good man," she said softly. "But he was also practical, careful, always thinking about the safe choice. You're not like that. You're the kind of man who rides into darkness because someone needs to, even if it costs you everything." "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "It is," she said, "because I'm the kind of woman who'll ride in right beside you." And Josiah realized with a jolt that somewhere in the past few days, this had stopped being just about justice or honor or redemption. It had become personal. He'd started to care again, and that terrified him more than any of Carson's hired guns. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost on the ground and a bite in the air that promised winter wasn't far off. Josiah made a big show of saddling Abraham, loading his saddlebags, and saying his goodbyes to the three sisters on the front porch where anyone watching from the hills would see. Martha gripped his hand, her eyes conveying everything they couldn't say aloud. Amanda gave him a small packet of food for the road. Rebecca just stared at him with those impossibly blue eyes and whispered, "Come back." He mounted up, tipped his hat, and rode out, heading south toward the main trail as if he were really leaving. But 2 miles down the road, where a stand of cottonwoods provided cover, he circled back, cut across Carson's land using a dry creek bed to avoid being seen, and made his way back to the Hayes Ranch from the east. He stashed Abraham in a draw near the creek where the horse would be hidden, but could graze and drink, then made his way on foot back to the barn. The waiting was the hardest part. He'd positioned himself in the loft where he could see the house and the approaches. With his rifle loaded and his revolver cleaned and ready, the sisters went about their normal routine. Martha working in the garden, Amanda hanging laundry, Rebecca tending to the chickens. To anyone watching, they looked like three women trying to carry on alone, vulnerable and unprotected. Perfect bait. Hours passed, the sun climbed and then began its descent. Josiah's muscles cramped from holding still for so long, and he fought the urge to move or shift position. He'd learned patience during the war, how to wait in silence for hours, how to become part of the landscape, how to breathe slowly and shallowly, and not think about anything except the moment. Dusk was settling over the valley when he finally saw them. Three riders coming in from the northwest, moving slowly and carefully as if they wanted to be seen, but not too soon. Josiah recognized the lead rider immediately from descriptions. Jake Garrett, Carson's foreman, a big man with a scarred face and a reputation for violence. The other two were ranch hands, hard-faced men who wore their guns like they knew how to use them. They rode right up to the house, bold as you please. Garrett dismounted and knocked on the door. Through the barn's gaps in the wood, Josiah could hear their voices carrying in the still evening air. "Ladies," Garrett said when Martha opened the door, "heard your preacher friend left. Mr. Carson wanted me to come check on you. Make sure you're doing all right." "We're fine," Martha said coldly. "You can tell Mr. Carson we don't need his concern." "Now that's not very neighborly." Garrett smiled, and even at this distance, Josiah could see it wasn't a nice expression. "Mr. Carson is prepared to make you a very generous offer. More than generous considering the circumstances. Why don't you ladies invite us in and we can discuss it proper-like?" "No," Martha said, "please leave our property." Garrett's smile disappeared. "That wasn't a request, ma'am. See, Mr. Carson is tired of waiting, and he sent us to make sure you understand that his patience has run out." One of the other men, a younger cowboy with nervous eyes, moved toward the door. Martha tried to close it, but Garrett jammed his boot in the frame. That was Josiah's signal. He stood, raised his rifle, and called out from the loft. "I'd step back if I were you, Garrett." All three men spun, hands dropping to their guns. Garrett's face twisted with rage when he saw Josiah silhouetted against the darkening sky. "You," he spat, "preacher." "Actually, these days I prefer witness," Josiah said calmly. "As in, I'm witnessing you trespassing on private property and threatening three women. That's a crime, even in Wyoming, even when the sheriffs bought and paid for." "You're making a big mistake, preacher man." "Probably, but here's the thing, Garrett. I've got a rifle pointed at your chest, and I'm a better shot than you think. So why don't you and your boys mount up and ride back to Carson with a message? These women aren't going anywhere. And if anyone else dies mysteriously on this property, everyone in the territory is going to know exactly who's responsible." For a long moment, no one moved. Josiah could see Garrett calculating, weighing his options. Three armed men against one preacher in a barn loft, except that one preacher had the high ground and the element of surprise. And then Martha stepped forward, and she was holding a rifle of her own, pointed steadily at Garrett's midsection. Amanda appeared at the window with another rifle. Rebecca emerged from around the side of the house with a shotgun that looked almost comically large in her small hands. But she held it like she knew which end was which, 4 against 3. And the three looked suddenly a lot less confident. "You heard the Reverend," Martha said quietly. "Get off our land." Garrett's face was purple with fury, but he wasn't stupid. He backed away from the door, mounted his horse in one smooth motion. "This ain't over," he said. "Mr. Carson." "Can go to hell," Martha finished. "We're not leaving. We're not selling. And if you or anyone else comes onto this property again without an invitation, we'll shoot first and ask questions later. Wyoming law gives us that right." The three riders wheeled their horses and galloped off, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of hoofbeats in their wake. Josiah waited until they were completely out of sight before climbing down from the loft. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump that came after a crisis. He'd been ready to shoot, ready to kill if necessary, and the realization of how close they'd come to violence left him feeling hollow. Martha met him in the yard, still carrying her rifle. "That was stupid," Josiah finished. "Dangerous. Probably going to make everything worse." "I was going to say brave," Martha said. "But yes, also those other things." They stood there in the gathering darkness. Four people who'd just faced down three killers and somehow survived. Amanda was already heading back inside to bar the doors. Rebecca was checking her shotgun with shaking hands. But Martha just looked at Josiah, and he saw something in her expression that made his breath catch. "You came back," she said simply. "I told you I would." Men tell me a lot of things. They usually don't mean them. Josiah thought about Eleanor, about promises made and kept and broken, about the vows he'd taken at his ordination, about the faith he'd lost, and the unexpected grace of finding something worth fighting for in the ruins of his old life. "I mean it," he said. And standing there in the dust, in the dying light, with the threat of violence still hanging in the air and danger circling like coyotes in the darkness, he knew it was true. He'd stopped running. Whatever came next, he would face it here. The retaliation came 3 days later, and it came with fire. Josiah was in the barn just after midnight. He'd taken to sleeping there, keeping watch, when he heard Abraham whinny an alarm. He was up and moving before his eyes were fully open, grabbing his rifle and rushing to the barn door. The sky to the north was orange. Flames were eating their way across Carson's land, pushed by a steady wind that was driving them directly toward the Hayes property. Someone had set a prairie fire, and if it reached their grassland, the ranch would burn to ashes in a matter of hours. "Fire!" Josiah roared, running toward the house and pounding on the door. "Prairie fire coming in from the north! Move!" The three sisters emerged in their nightgowns, hair unpinned, eyes wide with terror. But they didn't panic. Martha immediately started issuing orders like a general commanding troops. "Amanda, get every bucket and barrel we have to the creek. Rebecca, start soaking blankets. Reverend, we need to cut a fire break between our land and the grassland. Now." They worked with the desperate speed of people who knew they were fighting for their lives. Josiah hitched the plow to Abraham, and he and Martha worked side by side, cutting a strip of bare earth between the ranch buildings and the advancing flames. The plow was old and kept catching on rocks, and Abraham was terrified of the smoke and fire smell. But they pushed on, turning over furrow after furrow of dirt and grass. Amanda and Rebecca hauled water from the creek, soaking the house and barn, creating wet zones that might slow the fire if it jumped the firebreak. The work was backbreaking, endless, and the flames kept coming, a wall of orange light that grew larger and closer with every passing minute. By the time the fire reached their firebreak, all four of them were black with soot and ash, coughing, exhausted, and still fighting. The flames hit the turned earth and slowed, searching for fuel, finding only bare dirt. But sparks and embers carried by the wind were landing everywhere, starting spot fires that had to be beaten out with wet blankets. They fought for hours. Josiah lost track of time, lost track of everything except the next fire to beat out, the next ember to stomp into the dirt, the next desperate trip to the creek for more water. Somewhere in the chaos, he found himself working side by side with Martha, their hands touching as they wielded the same blanket, their eyes meeting in mutual understanding that they were probably going to die here, but they'd die fighting. Dawn came slowly, revealing a landscape transformed. Carson's grassland was blackened wasteland for miles. The Hayes property had survived. Barely. The house and barn were standing, singed but intact, protected by the firebreak and desperate effort. But their pasture was gone, burned to ash, and the cattle had scattered in terror. They sat together in the yard, too exhausted to move, staring at the smoking ruins. Josiah's hands were blistered and bleeding. Martha's hair was singed on one side. Amanda was crying silently, tears tracking through the soot on her face. Rebecca just stared at nothing, shock settling in. "Carson did this," Martha said, her voice flat. "He burned his own land to get to us." "He'll claim it was an accident," Amanda said dully. "Lightning strike, careless campfire, anything. No way to prove it was deliberate." "And even if we could prove it," Rebecca added, "the sheriff wouldn't care." They were right, and Josiah knew it. Carson had escalated to attempted murder, and there was no legal recourse, no protection, nothing except their own determination and whatever defense they could mount. "We need help," Josiah said. "Real help. Not the sheriff, not the law. People, neighbors, anyone who might stand with us." "There is no one," Martha said hopelessly. "You've seen this town. Everyone's too scared or too bought off to help." But Josiah was thinking about Reverend Mills, about the shame in the old preacher's eyes when he'd admitted his cowardice. He was thinking about the shopkeepers who'd avoided his eyes, the ranchers who'd looked away, the people who knew what Carson was doing but were too frightened to act. "Fear works both ways," he said slowly. "Carson rules through fear. But what if we could show people that standing up to him is possible, that he's not invincible?" "How?" Martha asked. "We go public. We ride into town, call a town meeting at the church, and we tell everyone exactly what's been happening. We lay out the deaths, the intimidation, the fire. We make Carson's crimes so visible, so undeniable, that staying silent becomes its own kind of guilt." "They won't believe us," Amanda protested. "Maybe not all of them, but some will. And sometimes all it takes is a few people willing to stand up to make others find their courage." It was a desperate plan. It probably wouldn't work. But as Josiah looked at these three women, survivors who'd lost everything but refused to break, he knew they had to try, because the alternative was to surrender. And none of them knew how to do that. "When?" Martha asked. "Tomorrow. We rest today, tend to our wounds, gather what evidence we have. Tomorrow we take the fight to Carson." "What if he tries to stop us before we reach town?" Josiah met her eyes. "Then we make sure someone survives to tell the story." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. The next morning they rode into Redemption Creek together. 4 battered survivors on 3 horses, moving slowly down the main street like a funeral procession. They'd deliberately chosen Sunday morning, when everyone would be gathered for church services, when the maximum number of people would see them. Josiah had cleaned his preacher's collar and wore his black coat despite the burns and tears. The 3 sisters wore their best dresses, but there was no hiding the soot still staining their skin, The burns on their hands, the exhaustion in their faces. They looked like what they were, victims of attempted murder. People stared as they passed. Conversations died. Even the children stopped playing to watch this strange silent parade. They rode directly to the church where Reverend Mills was just beginning the morning service. Josiah didn't wait for an invitation. He walked straight down the center aisle with Martha, Amanda, and Rebecca behind him, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Mills stared at them from the pulpit, his weathered face going pale. "Reverend Caine?" "Forgive the interruption," Josiah said, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church. "But these people need to hear the truth about what's happening in this valley. And I need to say it while I'm still alive to say it." A murmur ran through the congregation. Josiah could see Sheriff Coleman in a back pew, his hand moving toward his gun. But he also saw homesteaders and shopkeepers, ranchers and their wives, people who'd lived in fear for so long, they'd forgotten what courage looked like. "My name is Josiah Caine," he began. "I'm a traveling preacher, and 3 weeks ago I stopped at the Hayes Ranch for a meal and a night's shelter. What I found there was 3 widowed women living under a death sentence." He told them everything. About Thomas Hayes dying in his sleep after refusing Carson's offer. About William Turner falling from a barn loft rigged with rope. About James Porter trampled by a mysteriously maddened horse. About cattle scattered in the night, hired guns threatening women alone, and a prairie fire set deliberately to burn them out. 3 good men are dead," Josiah said, his voice ringing with the passion he had once brought to sermons about salvation and grace. "Murdered for the sin of standing between Dalton Carson and land he wants. And not one person in this town has had the courage to say it out loud." "You got proof of these accusations?" Sheriff Coleman called out. "Rope marks on barn boards," Josiah shot back. "Witnesses to threats. A prairie fire that started on Carson's land and burned directly toward the Hayes property on a night with steady north wind, which means someone lit it, knowing exactly where it would go." "Circumstantial," Coleman sneered. "Fantasy and grief talking." "Then let's talk about patterns," Amanda stepped forward, her educated voice clear and precise. 3 men married to 3 sisters, 3 deaths in 3 months, 3 accidents that all benefited the same person. What are the odds of that happening naturally, Sheriff? What would a reasonable person conclude? Silence. People were looking at each other now, the math clicking into place. "Carson ain't here to defend himself," Coleman protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Martha said, and there was steel in her tone. "He's not. He never is he? He sends his men to do his dirty work while he sits in his big house and plays the respectable rancher. But we all know what he is. We've all known for years. We just didn't want to say it because we were afraid." "And fear is how evil wins," Josiah added. "Fear is how good people become complicit in murder. I spent 3 years running from my own pain, my own failures. But these 3 women taught me that running doesn't solve anything. Standing up does. Fighting back does." He looked around the church, meeting eyes that had been avoiding his. "I know most of you are scared. I know Carson has power and money and guns. But he's one man, and we're a community. If we stand together, if we make it clear that we won't tolerate murder and intimidation, then he loses. Fear only works if we let it." A long moment of silence. Then a voice from the middle of the congregation, a homesteader named Peterson, that Josiah had met at the general store, spoke up. "My brother was trying to file on land near the Hayes property 2 years back. He died in a hunting accident. Gun went off somehow while he was climbing a fence. Never did make sense to me. John was careful with firearms his whole life." Another voice. "My cousin lost his herd to rustlers right after he turned down an offer from Carson. Sheriff said there was nothing he could do." A woman in the front pew. "My husband saw Jake Garrett near the Hayes place the morning Thomas died. He was too scared to mention it." One by one, people were speaking up, sharing their own experiences with Carson's reign of terror. Each story alone meant nothing, could be explained away, dismissed. But together they painted a picture of systematic violence and intimidation that couldn't be denied. Josiah saw Sheriff Coleman edge toward the door, but Reverend Mills stepped down from the pulpit and blocked his path. "You'll stay, Sheriff," Mills said quietly. "It's time we all heard the full truth." And in that moment, Josiah saw courage being reborn. Not the flashy courage of gunfights and grand gestures, but the quiet courage of ordinary people deciding they'd had enough. What do we do? Someone asked. How do we stop him? We bear witness, Josiah said. We write down every incident, every threat, every suspicious death. We send those records to the territorial governor, to newspapers in Cheyenne and Denver, to federal marshals. We make Carson's crimes so documented, so public, that even his money can't cover them up. And we stand together, refuse to sell to him, refuse to work for him, refuse to let fear rule us. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wouldn't bring back the dead or undo the damage. But it was something. It was resistance. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. The town meeting lasted 3 hours, and by the end of it, Josiah had 30 signed statements from people who'd witnessed Carson's intimidation or had experienced it themselves. Reverend Mills agreed to serve as custodian of the records and to send copies to the territorial capital. A committee was formed to patrol the Hayes property in shifts, so the sisters would never be alone and unprotected. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. They were leaving the church when Josiah saw the riders coming. 5 of them this time, led by Dalton Carson himself, a man in his 50s, well-dressed, riding a beautiful black stallion that probably cost more than the Hayes ranch was worth. Reverend Caine, Carson said, his voice cultured and smooth, I hear you've been spreading lies about me. Not lies, Josiah said, truth, which is probably why it bothers you so much. Carson's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, preacher. A mistake that could get people killed. Is that a threat? It's a fact. You've stirred up these simple folks with your conspiracy theories and your righteous indignation. But when you move on, and traveling preachers always move on, these people will still have to live with the consequences. With me. I'm not moving on, Josiah said flatly. I'm staying. Something flickered in Carson's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Staying. You, a circuit preacher with no ties to this place, are going to stay and protect 3 widows from the big bad rancher. That's quite noble. Also quite stupid. Maybe, but I'm done being smart if smart means turning my back on evil. Carson leaned forward in his saddle. Those 3 women are sitting on land that rightfully should be mine. I need that water source for my cattle. Without it, my ranch will fail, and 100 men will lose their jobs. Is that what you want? Economic collapse because of your moral posturing? I want you to stop murdering people, Josiah said. Seems like a pretty reasonable request. I haven't murdered anyone, Carson said, his voice cold, and you can't prove I have. Maybe not in a court, but we don't need a court conviction to make your life difficult. We have public opinion now. We have witnesses. We have documentation. And we have something you can't buy or intimidate away. We have people who've decided they'd rather die free than live in fear. Carson stared at him for a long moment, and Josiah could see the calculations happening behind those cold eyes. Could see the rancher weighing his options, considering his next move. You're a fool, Carson said finally, and fools die in the territory. Remember that, preacher, when you're lying in the dark wondering if tonight's the night someone puts a bullet through your window. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken threats. Martha stepped up beside Josiah, her hand finding his arm. He's not going to give up. I know. This could go on for months, years even. I know that too. She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. Why are you really staying, Josiah? And don't give me that line about fighting evil. There's more to it than that. Josiah thought about Eleanor, about the faith he'd lost and the purpose he'd found in this dusty corner of Wyoming. He thought about 3 women who'd survived more than most people could imagine and had somehow held on to their humanity. He thought about the way Martha's hand felt on his arm and the way Rebecca smiled when she thought no one was watching and the way Amanda quoted poetry while washing dishes. Because for the first time in 3 years, he said slowly, I want to be somewhere, not running toward the next town or away from the last one, just here with people I care about. Martha's breath caught. Josiah, I know it's fast. I know it doesn't make sense. I know I'm a widower and you're a widow and we've both got grief we're carrying. But somewhere in the past few weeks, This stopped being about justice and started being about you. All three of you. This place, this fight, it matters to me. You're not a traveling preacher anymore, she said softly. No, I'm just a man trying to find his way home. And Martha, this strong, fierce, beautiful woman who'd buried a husband and refused to break, smiled. Then welcome home, Reverend. Behind them, the town of Redemption Creek was waking up to its own courage. People were talking, planning, organizing. The spell of fear that Carson had cast was breaking. One small act of defiance at a time. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more threats, more danger, possibly more violence. Carson wasn't finished, and men like him never went quietly. But standing there in the morning sun with Martha beside him and hope rising like smoke from the ashes, Josiah believed they had a chance. He'd stopped running. He'd found something worth fighting for. And whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. 6 months later, Josiah stood in the barn loft that had once been a murder scene and watched the sun set over land that was finally at peace. The changes had come slowly, then all at once. Carson had made 2 more attempts, another night raid, another fire, but each time the town had rallied. Men had ridden out to help defend the Hayes property. Women had brought food and supplies. Even Sheriff Coleman, finding himself increasingly isolated, had grudgingly started doing his actual job. The territorial governor had sent investigators after the 4th formal complaint. Carson's foreman, Jake Garrett, had been arrested for cattle rustling and, under questioning, had started talking. Not about the murders, he was too smart for that, but about intimidation tactics, about threats, about patterns of violence that couldn't be ignored. Carson himself had never been charged with anything. He was too careful, too connected, but his reputation was destroyed, his empire crumbling. Men stopped working for him. Banks stopped lending to him. The social ostracism that frontier communities could inflict when they chose to was more effective than any legal prosecution. Last month, he'd sold the Bar C ranch and moved to California. Good riddance. The Hayes property had survived. More than survived. Thrived. With Josiah's help and the community's support, they'd rebuilt the barn, expanded the herd, and even hired 2 ranch hands who worked for fair wages and treated the sisters with respect. The ranch was profitable again, secure again, finally free from the shadow of death that had hung over it for so long. And Josiah had stopped being a traveling preacher. He still gave sermons sometimes at Reverend Mills's church, still counseled people struggling with faith or doubt. But mostly he was just Josiah Caine, more a rancher, helping to build something permanent in a landscape that had taught him what really mattered. He heard footsteps on the ladder and turned to see Martha climbing up to join him. She moved easily now, without the exhaustion and fear that had marked her movements when they first met. She was still lean and work-hardened, but there was color in her cheeks and light in her eyes. "Amanda's making dinner," she said, settling beside him. "Rebecca's teaching her to make those biscuits her husband used to like. It's going to be a disaster, but don't tell her I said so." Josiah smiled. Wouldn't dream of it. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and orange. Below them, the ranch was settling in for the night, cattle grazing peacefully, chickens roosting, the sound of Amanda's laughter drifting from the house. "I've been thinking," Martha said slowly, "about something you said that first day, about running from your pain. I remember. Did you stop running, or did you just find something worth staying for?" Josiah thought about this. Maybe they're the same thing. Maybe the way you stop running is by finding a reason to stand still. Martha's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. "And have you found a reason?" He turned to look at her, this woman who'd faced down killers and fires and loss with equal courage. "I found 3 reasons. 3 sisters who taught me that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about showing up anyway." "Just the 3 sisters?" Martha asked, and there was something playful in her voice, something young and hopeful that the grief hadn't quite managed to kill. "Well," Josiah said carefully, "one of those sisters in particular, if we're being specific." Martha laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound he'd heard in years. "Good, because I've been thinking we might need a 4th signature on the deed to this property. Someone permanent. Someone who knows how to use a rifle and isn't afraid of hard work and occasionally gives sermons that make people cry. That sounds like a proposal, Miss Hayes. It is, Reverend Caine. Josiah felt something in his chest that he'd thought died with Eleanor. Not love replacing love, but new love growing beside old grief. Both could be true. Both could be honored. Then my answer is yes, he said, on one condition. What's that? We do this properly. Courting, engagement, a wedding with all the trimmings. I may have skipped a few steps rushing in to save you all, but I'm not rushing this. You deserve to be wooed, Martha Hayes. She smiled, squeezed his hand. Deal, but just so we're clear, I'm the one who saved you. You showed up broken and running, and we gave you a reason to stay. She was right, and Josiah knew it. He'd come to this ranch as a man fleeing his own ghosts, and he'd found 3 women who'd turned him back into someone who believed in tomorrow. As they climbed down from the loft and walked back to the house together, Josiah thought about all the sermons he'd given over the years about faith and redemption. Turned out, redemption wasn't something you found in a church or a prayer book. It was something you built, day by day, alongside people who believed you were worth saving. The door opened, releasing light and warmth and the smell of cooking. Probably terrible biscuits, but made with love. Amanda called out that dinner was ready. Rebecca was setting the table, and Martha walked beside him, her hand in his, both of them heading toward a future that looked nothing like their pasts, but was precious precisely because of that. Josiah had come to this ranch looking for nothing more than a meal and a night's shelter. He'd found a home, a family, and a purpose. He'd learned that traveling preachers sometimes stop traveling, that widows can love again, that 3 sisters facing impossible odds could change the world if they just refused to give up. And as he stepped into the warmth of the house with Martha beside him, Josiah offered up a prayer, his first real prayer in 3 years, thanking whatever power guided the universe for bringing him to this dusty corner of Wyoming, to this cursed ranch that turned out to be blessed, to these 3 remarkable women who'd saved him by letting him help save them. Sometimes the best journeys end exactly where they're supposed to. Sometimes coming home means finding people who see you clearly and love you anyway. Sometimes faith returns not in a moment of revelation, but in the quiet choice to stay, to fight, to build something worth protecting. Josiah Caine, traveling preacher, had finally stopped traveling, and the life he found waiting at the end of his journey was better than anything he could have imagined. If this story touched your heart, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd subscribe to keep following these journeys together. Give a thumbs up to help others find this tale, and share in the comments what spoke to you most deeply. Your words mean everything. Thank you for being part of this community.